Marxists in the White House, communism spreading throughout America. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Are you paying attention to what's taking place in America? It was subtle at first, but now, not so subtle. The Marxists have come out of their dark corners. The communists are on the march throughout America. Chinese influences are spreading everywhere, buying up property, selling their communist rot into the minds of our next generation of leaders on our college campuses, taking over the economy, not just in America, but around the world, becoming a world player with foreign policy, taking over America's role on the global stage. If you're not paying attention, then you're missing out on how America is being crumbled right under our own noses. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, where I also invite you to sign up to my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and it doesn't just contain my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcast, but also my daily commentaries that I write all day long at the Washington Times. And these commentaries give you the information, the F-word, facts, the data you need to fight the far left influences in America, like the communists and Marxists, like the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes, who have no business being in American politics because they're card-carrying socialists and they openly mock the Constitution, the very Constitution that they have to take an oath to uphold and defend on day one of their terms in office. How can you be a socialist and serve as a politician in America? You can't. You're just mocking the Constitution. But let me also quickly mention you may get Bold and Blunt anywhere podcasts are offered. That's right, anywhere. Look at these recent headlines. New York Times, China sends record number of military planes near Taiwan. Fox News, China flies more than 150 military planes toward Taiwan. The Associated Press, China flies 103 military planes toward Taiwan in a new high in activity. China flies 103 warplanes toward Taiwan, Voice of America. Get the general theme here? The takeaway isn't so much that China's sending in the planes over Taiwan, it's that China is emboldened to send so many record levels of military planes toward Taiwan in an obvious show of intimidation and attempt at domination. And the reason they're doing it is because, in 2 words, Joe Biden, right? This wouldn't happen under a stronger administration. This would not happen if America was strong right now in the eyes of the world. Everybody sees Joe Biden stumbling and bumbling about. All of America's enemies, all of enemies of freedom and the free world see that Joe Biden is too weak to do anything more than talk and hold press conferences, which he can barely do at all, to do anything more than that. And so they're taking advantage. They know Joe Biden's time in the White House is short. They know they don't have more than a year and a half or so to live out the designs that they've been strategizing from day one of Joe Biden's weak administration. And so they're rushing. They're rushing to exert their power. They're rushing to exert their dominance. They're rushing to live out their long-held plans to destroy free societies before Joe Biden is booted from the White House. And we get somebody strong in the White House, like, a cupcake even. But I want to be fair. I want to be fair to Democrats, right? Democrats, which have become the party of communists. It's been Republicans' fault as well on China. For years, there were many Republicans, many fine Republicans, many America-loving Republicans who thought that if China were only open to more capitalistic influences, to more free market influences, that it would naturally shed its communist coat, that it would naturally become more free. And that didn't happen. Instead, China did a sort of hybrid capitalistic system, the type of system that Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum now wants to see adopted in nations around the world. And what it really is a slow walk toward communism, because you can't have communism, you can't have state control of the economy and a free market at the same time. The two don't work together. The two are in opposition to each other. So what you will eventually have, if China has its way, if the World Economic Forum has its way, if Democrats in America have their way, is you will have this sort of communism creep into the economies and societies around the world. And fine for those countries that want to adopt this policy. But in America, we still have a constitution and we still have a promise of limited government, and we still have a spirit of freedom that is rooted on the concept of individualism and individual rights coming from God, and government being there as servants of the people to simply preserve and protect those God-given individual liberties. In fact, we have written in our founding documents the provision that if government goes beyond that limited government boundary, that it is the duty of the people to cast off that government and to implement a new form, more free in principle. Read, for instance, the Declaration of Independence, which is the compass of America's government. Anyhow, back to the communism that has seeped into America and the perilous times that we find ourselves in, because too many people aren't aware that this free market that we're living under right now is really tainted with all types of Marxist, communist influences. DEI, the woke corporate structure, the constant division and pitting of one demographic in America versus another demographic. The rising tide in our younger generations to hate America, to declare America an enemy of the world, to point to America as the responsible party for all that ails the world, instead of, and this is more factually speaking, the savior of freedom and free societies around the world. These are all designs of the communists, the left, the collectivists, the Marxists, to divide, then conquer, right? And in America, there are so many Chinese communist influences that it's really head-spinning when you think of how far we have strayed from the limited government principles founders gave us based on God-given individual liberties toward a mindset of collectivism where we actually embrace what we once abhorred. China's Belt and Road. There's this fact sheet that I'm reading from, U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Came out in 2019, and so just in a few short years, what I'm about to read from, you can just times it by about 10, because under Barack Obama first, and then under Joe Biden now, the growing influences in these various areas has only grown stronger. China's growing influence. Is America getting left behind? October 2019 from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. China's global investments have grown dramatically in recent years, surpassing the United States as the largest trading partner with many countries in Latin America and Africa, and challenging America's strategic influence across the globe. While the U.S. administration has proposed deep and disproportionate cuts to diplomacy and development for 3 consecutive years, China has doubled its foreign affairs budget since 2011. And now we wonder, why is China taking over on the world stage? Well, China's been strategically laying the groundwork for just such a time for many years. China has doubled its foreign affairs budget since 2011, as I said. And reading more from this, in 2018, China increased its budget for diplomacy by nearly 16% and its budget for foreign aid by nearly 7%. So China gets to pretend like it's walking the road of moral superiority by increasing its diplomatic influences around the world, right? Sending in the communist minions to pretend to be the saviors of what ails, and then also backing it with money, with foreign aid. Yet, reading from this piece again, the Chinese model of economic development has created dependencies. And there's where the rubber meets the road, right? China comes in and pretends, oh, let me help you. Let me help you. We're the good guys. Here, take some money. Here, take some foreign aid. We love you. We'll help you. We want to help. And just bring your society into the modern times with technology and food aid and whatever else you need and education and so on and so forth. But the Chinese model of economic development has created dependencies in countries unable to repay their loans, and it has been reluctant to contribute to international efforts to address global threats. That's because China wants to go its own way, right? Like America once did. America, once upon a time, sort of sidestepped the United Nations and the global entities that always wanted to work in cooperation because America stood alone. America was exceptional. America was a different country, didn't play that socialist communist game. We didn't need to make partnerships with others around the world because we were America. We didn't need them. They needed us. Now China is slowly taking over that role, right? China's going around the world pretending to be the good guy, tossing out some money, throwing in some aid here, pretending to help out. And then actually what it's doing is creating dependencies. It's making other nations dependent on China. And then it refuses to work in partnership with all these other entities that America under Joe Biden and under Barack Obama are working with. The type of entities that want to bind us, right, and slow our own development. The type of entities like the World Health Organization that wants to create a treaty that puts the World Health Organization's leaders in charge of determining when pandemics break and how countries should respond to pandemics, meaning more lockdowns, more shutdowns of economic engines and so forth. And America now under Joe Biden and previously under Barack Obama worked with all these UN players that want to cripple America's economy by forcing us to abide environmental regulations that basically put a stop to any kind of growth. Well, China doesn't play that, right? So as America is receding, China is growing bigger, stronger, and seemingly, at least on the surface at first, friendlier to nations of the world. So helpful, those communists, always so helpful. Meanwhile, in America, we've got Joe Biden leading the way toward demise, ignoring the fact that China's buying up land, right? China's influences in colleges, China's model being pushed through the economic systems and so forth. Our corporations more and more doing business with China and then turning around and chastising anyone in America in positions of leadership or influence or public who criticize China for its atrocities, right? NBA, think National Basketball Association. And meanwhile, Americans more and more are just worried about where to get the next cheap good, right? They want cheap Cheap stuff made in China. America's selling its own self down the stream. And it's sad. It's very sad. And my guest today is going to speak to even more China influences in America. More importantly, though, what America can do to fight back. Yes, there is still hope. That is the good news. America is not dead. Bill Gertz. Bill Gertz is my guest today. He's a noted expert on China policy. He's written books about China. He speaks widely about China, communism, Marxism, and so forth. And he's also a noted Washington Times opinion writer. Bill, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
So because of your area of expertise, I kind of wanted to talk in general whether China has the better long-term strategy for global dominance. But I wanted to start by talking about one of your pieces that you posted on gertzfile.com, GERTZ China's military working on AI weaponry. Talk about what's going on there and why America needs to be concerned.
Yeah, this is really a signal that the political war over dominance of artificial intelligence is underway. And basically, the story was about a report that showed how China was requiring all of its more than 100 artificial intelligence providers that provide things like the U.S. ChatGPT type of service, that they must conform to communist ideology. And the reason for this is obviously the Chinese are very afraid that they won't be able to control artificial intelligence, which they're also developing for military purposes in a big way. Of course, the U.S. is doing the same thing. Artificial intelligence is a big issue, and whether it should be controlled. Senator Chuck Schumer announced earlier this year that he was seeking to find some way to control legislatively American artificial intelligence developers, and his comment was, we can't let China set the standards for AI.
Yeah, you know what? That's kind of the real elephant in the room right there. Because if you look at how AI is developed, it feeds off of data. The more data you have, the more accurate your AI. China has no constitutional concerns when it comes to scooping up data. It puts cameras everywhere. America has constitutional boundaries. So how do you see America winning the war, the technology war, the AI war against a country like China?
Well, the issue is basically to produce high-quality artificial intelligence, you need two things. You need data and software on one hand, and you need high-speed computing on the other hand. Right now, the U.S. dominates the high-speed computing area, and the U.S. last October imposed export controls on the export of advanced microchips used for AI to China. And the Chinese retaliated by imposing sanctions on some rare earth minerals that are also used in producing those chips. So you can see that there's kind of already a technology war going on. The Commerce Secretary is in China. This is going to be one of the main topics of discussion. The Biden administration's launched kind of like a détente policy, trying to schmooze the Chinese, and Chinese aren't having any of it. They regard the United States as their main enemy, as the leader of world capitalism to be vanquished ultimately, so that Chinese communism can be spread throughout the world. That's kind of the situation from a political standpoint.
See, that's a little bit concerning with Joe Biden at the helm, right? Because he's not exactly a tough strategist when it comes to dealing with China. So in this face-off that you just described, very interesting, very fascinating, but it looks very perilous for America. Am I wrong there?
Well, yeah. I mean, President Biden is surely perceived and is a weak president. Every time he speaks, you wonder if he's really all there. That said, the people pulling the strings behind the scenes have an agenda, and they're working to try and impose this China policy that they've set in motion going back to November of last year when Biden met with Xi Jinping in Bali, and they said, "Hey, we need to communicate more." The Biden administration, China hands, have accepted this Graham Allison idea of the Thucydides traps, that war is inevitable because of a rising power and a declining power. I don't buy that argument at all. I think the Biden administration is working to develop their policies around that notion. So the idea of war fears is driving their policies, whereas in the past, Reagan and Trump, it was peace through strength. And that's really the key. Dictatorships like China, communist dictatorships like China, do not respect weakness or vacillation or conciliation. They only respect strength. And it's when you show strength that then you can bring results. They're doing just the opposite. They're showing weakness. We've sent 3 senior officials to China, and the whole idea is that we need to talk more, and the Chinese have not reciprocated. They haven't backed down at all. Under Xi Jinping in China, the supreme leader, they've reimposed what they call Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics. And in doing so, they kind of killed the goose that lays the golden egg of economic prosperity. They allowed for their period of what they called reform and opening up, a relaxation of communist ideology to allow the economy to flourish. And now they're retrenching away from that. Business leaders are being cut out. Corporations are being divided up, and their economy is in real trouble. Now, they still have a lot of control mechanisms to keep their economy going, but the long-term prospects for their economy, they've got a local government financial crisis, they've got a youth unemployment crisis, and a number of these, and their economy is declining. It's no longer on track to exceed the U.S. as the world's largest economy.
But go back to what you said a couple minutes ago about how changing leading nations on the world stage spark conflicts and tensions. And Republicans are sort of falling into that mindset. There are too many Republicans, it seems, who are putting China interests above that of America's because of their own personal business interests. Do you see that? And if you do, to what extent do you find that fueling China's rise?
Oh, well, yeah, this has been a big problem. It's the debate over China, and I outlined this in my book, Deceiving the Sky, which basically states that the 40-year policy of engaging China economically, diplomatically, and in many other ways was supposed to moderate the Chinese system and produce a non-threatening, non-communist system, and it was an utter failure. Now, that policy is still sort of locked in, so we've got this massive engagement economically. It's starting to decline. A lot of financial businesses are pulling out of China, but the Biden administration has made clear they do not believe in so-called decoupling from China. They want to continue this economic engagement, and I think they're being pushed to do that by Wall Street and business interests that they want to make money in China, and they don't look at the long-term disastrous effect of what's really happening behind the scenes in China, that China has a goal to become the world's leader, and that behind that goal, the main obstacle to achieving global supremacy or hegemony is the United States, and they're actively working to weaken and ultimately destroy the United States. And this is not well recognized. There's beginnings of a recognition that this is kind of the problem. I think the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party is doing some good work, but overall, I think both parties they don't quite understand the danger posed by China, which is an existential threat. So the war in Ukraine is a problem, Russia is a problem, but the big threat is communist China.
Which goes back to the larger theme of what I wanted to talk about. Does China have the better long-term strategy for global dominance? And I'd have to say, based on what you just said, America may have a 40-year game plan against China, but China seems to have a 400-year game plan or even longer. It just seems like China, no matter what, is inflicting damage on America, not just economically, but culturally. And to me, that's the bigger danger, right? When you change the mindset of a nation, which is what's taking place in America.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the anti-U.S. activities here are in some way linked to Chinese communist ideology, which is Marxist-Leninist in the sense that it's Marxist, which is a false ideology, doesn't have any economic backbone, and then Leninism, which is a way to rule over using Marxism as a tool. There are a lot of Marxists in the U.S., and they've infiltrated into the Biden administration at the upper levels. And so they kind of look at China as the leading ideological light for the future. And for that reason, you can see a lot of policies which are really destructive to the United States, culturally, economically, politically, in all areas. And there needs to be a better recognition in America, and I've tried to do that in my reporting, to let people know that what we're dealing with in China today is not something that's going to go away. This idea that if we just trade with them, if we just ignore their nuclear proliferation, if we ignore their human rights violations and genocide, that this is somehow will all work itself out over history, that China will become a non-threatening power. And it's just not working. We need to get much more educated about what the Chinese are up to. The government needs to tell the truth about what China's doing. Well, the Biden administration was doing that sort of in the beginning as a carryover from the previous Trump administration, but they have now reverted to this policy that I've covered for years, which is don't say anything to upset the Chinese, don't say anything that could lead to differences of opinion or perhaps some type of escalation or incident in a military incident in, say, the South China Sea or one of the areas near China. So we're not telling the truth about China, and that's really critical to do.
Yeah, it's almost like we've acknowledged defeat. And I know you wrote this book, A New Cold War is Underway, this time with China, and you studied this at length, but it almost seems like we are raising our hands in the air as a nation under this feckless puppet president called Joe Biden and conceding defeat to the Chinese. Am I wrong there?
Well, I don't think it's exactly that way. Like I said, I think they're being driven by business interests. I think they're divided internally. I know some of their officials, for example, Kurt Campbell in the White House is supposedly the China czar, has a much more centrist view. And in fact, he wrote a piece that appeared in a major journal, Foreign Affairs, before he was in office, stating that we were wrong about this engagement policy. On the other hand, you have the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of State who are more or less in the appeasement mode. Their idea is, we've got to prevent a war with China, and the only way to do that is to appease this emerging communist superpower. So they're divided, and the appeasement-oriented policies are getting much more traction than the more realistic policies that say, look, we've got to deal with this problem now, or we won't be able to deal with it in 10 or 15 years.
You know, the division alone would seem to me creates enough of a chaotic situation that the Chinese, the communist Chinese, are able to exploit it for their gain. And I suppose that's just one more concerned attack on there. But I wanted to quickly talk about solutions. Do you think a rise in American patriotism would naturally push back against China's takeover? Or what sort of solutions do you see on the horizon for America's win, given that we still have Joe Biden as president?
Absolutely. Greater patriotism, and education. Right now I think we're still reeling from the 2020 riots and the anti-police and anti-racism and radical gender ideologies that are driving the political left to portray the United States, not communist China or not revanchist Russia, but the United States as the center of all the world's problems. So they've tried to turn inward in attacking the United States. I think the New York Times 1619 Project was an example of this, where they tried to say that racism, slavery was the root of America when it wasn't. The root of America was the search for religious freedom when the Pilgrims came here. It had nothing to do with slavery. But yet we're promoting these narratives that portray the United States as the cause of all the world's ills. And so I think that a greater sense of explaining to the world that it was the capitalist free market system that has produced the greatest prosperity and human advancement in history. There's nothing like it in history, and it's all centered on America. And yet the left, the political left, the Marxists are portraying the United States as the source of all the world's evils. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to overthrow the U.S. system and replace it with an authoritarian, anti-capitalist Marxist regime.
Yep. And under this administration, it really is moving forward. I guess what you're saying is tell the truth about communism, and communism naturally recedes because nobody wants it. Is that pretty much it?
Yeah. I mean, it's, we need to leverage the millions of Americans who've come to this country from communist countries. I know one of my friends who's a Naval Academy professor of Chinese military history, Miles Yu, who was Pompeo's most senior China advisor. He grew up in the Cultural Revolution, and he understands what it's like. Others came from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and they can tell the story. Look, this is it. This is the last best hope for America, for humankind, is the United States, and that's kind of what we need to educate people about, and in a much more aggressive way. We don't teach it in schools now. The schools have been subverted into teaching anti-Americanism throughout, either directly or indirectly or subtly. So that's the key, I think, that at this point is to better educate people to these problems.
Yeah, 100% agree. Bill Gertz, podcast host, Victory Over Communism is the name of the podcast. The website is gertzfile.com. Best-selling author and media pundit. I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt and sharing your words of wisdom and insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Well, that's the sobering reality of the feckless Joe Biden administration. China is moving full steam ahead to dominate the world. Thank you for listening. I want to remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, where you may also subscribe to my Monday, Wednesday, Friday newsletter. And you can also get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. And if you're considering being a subscriber, why not? Check it out. You'll get all the great guests like Bill Gertz delivered right to your email box if you sign up for my newsletter. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.